The security guard didn't even look up from his clipboard when he delivered the words that hit like a physical blow. No proper identification, no entry. That's the policy. The elderly man standing at the memorial gate fumbled through his wallet one more time, his weathered hands shaking slightly as he searched through faded receipts and worn photographs. Driver's license expired. Military ID lost somewhere in the chaos of moving between 3 different care facilities in 2 years. Behind him, families with fresh flowers and folded flags walked freely through the entrance to honor their fallen heroes. Tour groups with cameras and guidebooks passed by without question. But he stood there, a 78-year-old veteran who'd served 3 tours in Vietnam, being turned away from the very memorial that bore the names of men he'd fought beside, bled with, and watched die. The guard finally glanced up, his expression a mixture of boredom and mild irritation. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. You're holding up the line." The words weren't cruel, just indifferent. Just another day, another rule to enforce, another person to process or reject. What the guard couldn't see, what the families and tourists walking past couldn't know, was that the man being turned away had a Bronze Star gathering dust in a storage unit he could no longer afford to visit. That his name belonged on the wall of heroes just as much as any etched in granite. That sometimes the very people we build memorials to honor become too old, too forgotten, too broken by bureaucracy to visit the monuments meant to celebrate their sacrifice. But standing just 30 feet away, loading camera equipment back into his car after filming a documentary segment, was someone who would understand the injustice unfolding at the memorial gate. Someone young enough to fight the system and seasoned enough to know when rules needed to be broken. Welcome to Echoes of Honor. Before we continue with this powerful moment that changed everything at our nation's most sacred memorial, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be shared, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being part of this community. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial stretched like a black granite wound through the heart of Washington, D.C., its polished surface reflecting the faces of visitors who came to touch names, leave flowers, and whisper prayers to friends who never made it home. Morning fog still clung to the grass around the memorial grounds, though the autumn sun was beginning to burn through, promising another clear October day perfect for remembrance. James Sullivan had been planning this visit for 6 months. Ever since his grandson had written that school report about the Vietnam War and asked him why he never talked about his service. Ever since the nightmares had started coming back with increasing frequency. Ever since the doctors had told him the cancer was spreading and time was becoming a luxury he could no longer take for granted. The trip from the assisted living facility in Baltimore had taken 3 hours by bus, then metro, then walking with legs that protested every step. His daughter had offered to drive him, but this was something he needed to do alone. Something between him and the ghosts that had been waiting 47 years for him to come home. He'd served with Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. Khe Sanh, Hue City, places that existed now only in history books and the memories of men who were disappearing one by one, taking their stories with them. He'd lost his best friend Bobby Martinez on Hill 881 South. Had carried wounded men through rice paddies under enemy fire. Had done things he'd never talked about, seen things he'd never forgotten, survived things that still woke him up screaming in the middle of the night. The memorial wasn't just a place to visit for James Sullivan. It was a place to finally come home. But now he stood at the entrance, wallet empty of the proper credentials, watching as the security guard's patience wore thin. Around him, other visitors moved freely through the gates. A mother with 3 young children explaining to them about sacrifice and service. A group of college students on a field trip, their professor pointing toward the wall and discussing the impact of war on American society. A businessman in an expensive suit checking his phone while walking past the entrance like he owned the place. None of them were stopped. None of them were questioned. None of them had to prove their right to be there. "Sir, you need to move along," the guard said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "If you don't have proper identification, you can't enter the memorial grounds." Security protocols. James nodded slowly, his throat too tight to speak. He'd known this might happen. The assisted living facility had warned him about updated security measures, about new requirements for visiting federal memorials. But somehow he'd hoped that showing up in his old Marine dress blues, even though they hung loose on his diminished frame, would be enough. That someone would look at him and just know. He turned away from the gate, each step feeling like a retreat from a battle he'd already lost before it began. The names on the wall would have to wait a little longer. Bobby Martinez would have to wait a little longer. The conversations he'd been rehearsing for 47 years would have to remain unspoken. Behind him, 30 feet away near the visitor center, Marcus Chin was packing the last of his camera equipment into a military-issue duffel bag. The 28-year-old Navy SEAL had spent the morning filming testimonials for a documentary about modern veterans, part of a community outreach program designed to bridge the gap between current and former service members. Marcus had been in the Navy for 8 years, with 4 deployments to Afghanistan and 2 to Iraq. He'd earned his trident through the most demanding training in the world, had served with distinction in operations that would never be fully declassified, and had returned home to a country that often seemed to have forgotten it was still at war. The documentary project was personal for him. His own grandfather had served in Korea and had spent the last 20 years of his life feeling disconnected from a military culture that had evolved beyond his recognition. Marcus had made a promise at his grandfather's funeral that he would do whatever he could to ensure other veterans didn't die feeling forgotten and alone. As he zipped up his equipment bag, movement at the memorial entrance caught his attention. An elderly man in an ill-fitting Marine dress uniform was walking away from the security checkpoint, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Even from a distance, Marcus could read the body language of someone who'd just been denied something important. Marcus had spent enough time around veteran gatherings to recognize the signs. The careful way the old man had prepared for this visit. The obvious pride taken in wearing the uniform, even though it no longer fit properly. The slow, deliberate walk of someone who'd made a pilgrimage only to be turned away at the gates. Something wasn't right. Marcus slung his bag over his shoulder and walked toward the memorial entrance, his instincts telling him to investigate. As he approached, he could hear the tail end of a conversation between the security guard and another visitor. "Yeah, we had to turn away some old Marine a few minutes ago. No proper ID. Rules are rules, you know? Can't make exceptions just because someone shows up in uniform." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He looked toward the memorial wall, where families were taking pictures and laying flowers at the base of the black granite. He thought about his grandfather, who'd had to fight for recognition of his service in Korea. He thought about the men whose names were etched on that wall, and what they would think about one of their brothers being denied entry to their memorial. That's when Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He walked quickly in the direction the elderly Marine had gone, scanning the surrounding area until he spotted the familiar silhouette near a bench about 100 yards from the memorial gates. The old man was sitting alone, staring back at the memorial with an expression that mixed longing with resignation. Marcus approached slowly, respectfully, the way he'd been taught to approach senior personnel. When he was close enough to speak without shouting, he stopped and came to attention. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice carrying the crisp professionalism of active military. "I'm Petty Officer Chin, United States Navy. I couldn't help but notice what happened at the gate." James looked up, surprised by the formal address. His eyes took in the young man standing before him, the bearing, the confidence, the respectful but direct manner of speaking. Even in civilian clothes, this was obviously a service member. "Son, it's all right," James said, his voice still rough with disappointment. "Rules are rules. I should have come prepared. Sir, with respect, the only rule that matters is that you earned your place at that memorial." Marcus gestured toward the wall. "You served with honor, and no bureaucratic policy should prevent you from paying your respects to fallen brothers." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge to everything that had just happened. James studied the young man's face, seeing something he recognized from his own youth, the absolute certainty that some things were more important than regulations. "I appreciate the sentiment, son, but I don't have the proper identification." The guard was clear about the requirements. Marcus smiled then, not with humor but with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent years learning how to accomplish impossible missions. "Sir, what's your name and unit?" "James Sullivan, Gunnery Sergeant, retired. Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines." "Kisan?" James's eyes widened slightly. "You know about Kisan?" "Every Marine knows about Kisan, sir. And every SEAL learns about what Marines did there." Marcus extended his hand. "It's an honor to meet you, Gunny. And you're absolutely coming with me to that memorial." Before James could protest, Marcus was already walking back toward the entrance, his stride purposeful and determined. James found himself following, not entirely sure what was happening but sensing that this young sailor had a plan. At the memorial gate, the same security guard was checking identification for a family of tourists. Marcus approached the checkpoint with James beside him, his bearing radiating the kind of authority that made people pay attention without understanding why. "Good morning," Marcus said to the guard, his voice friendly but unmistakably military. I need to escort this Marine to the memorial. The guard looked up, immediately recognizing Marcus as someone who commanded respect. I'm sorry, sir, but this gentleman was here earlier without proper identification. Policy requires. This man is Gunnery Sergeant James Sullivan, United States Marine Corps, Marcus interrupted smoothly. He served 3 tours in Vietnam, including Khe Sanh and Hue City. He earned a Bronze Star for valor under fire. And he's here today to pay respects to fallen brothers whose names are on that wall. The authority in Marcus's voice had drawn attention from other visitors. Several people had stopped to listen, including a woman with a folded flag and an elderly man wearing a Vietnam veteran baseball cap. Sir, I understand, but without proper identification, I can't. Then I'll take full responsibility, Marcus said, pulling out his military ID and handing it to the guard. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Chin, Naval Special Warfare. This Marine is my guest, and I'm escorting him to the memorial. The security guard found himself in an impossible position. On one hand, he had policies to enforce. On the other hand, he was facing a Navy SEAL who was clearly not going to take no for an answer, and whose bearing suggested he was accustomed to getting his way in difficult situations. But before the guard could respond, something unexpected happened. The woman with the folded flag stepped forward. Excuse me, she said quietly. Did you say this gentleman served at Khe Sanh? Marcus nodded. Yes, ma'am. Gunnery Sergeant Sullivan, Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. Tears filled the woman's eyes as she looked at James. My brother died at Khe Sanh. Lance Corporal Tommy Rodriguez, same battalion. She turned to the security guard. If this man served with my brother, then he has more right to be here than any of us. The elderly man in the Vietnam veteran cap moved closer. Son, he said to James, what was your MOS? 0311, sir. Rifleman. I was 0331. Machine gunner. 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines. We were at Khe Sanh too. He extended his hand. Welcome home, brother. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered around the memorial entrance. Other Vietnam veterans who'd been visiting the memorial. Families of fallen soldiers. Even tourists who'd been moved by the unfolding scene. The security guard found himself facing not just one Navy SEAL and one old Marine, but an impromptu assembly of people who understood that some things were more important than bureaucratic policies. Marcus never raised his voice, never made threats, never pulled rank in any official sense. He simply stood beside James Sullivan and made it clear that this Marine was going to visit the memorial, with or without official permission. This man earned his place here, Marcus said, his words carrying to everyone within earshot. Every name on that wall represents someone who served with honor, who sacrificed for something greater than themselves. Gunnery Sergeant Sullivan is one of them. He doesn't need a plastic card to prove his right to be here. He proved it 47 years ago in the jungles of Vietnam. The security guard looked around at the faces surrounding him, veterans, family members, tourists, all of them watching to see what he would do. The policy manual said one thing, but the weight of collective expectation said something else entirely. Finally, he stepped aside. Go ahead, sir, he said to James, his voice softer than it had been earlier. Welcome to the memorial. The crowd parted as Marcus and James walked through the entrance together. But they weren't alone. The woman with the folded flag walked with them, wanting to show James where her brother's name was etched in the granite. The machine gunner from 3rd Battalion joined them, sharing stories about Khe Sanh as they approached the wall. Other veterans fell in step, creating an informal honor guard for a brother who'd almost been denied his homecoming. As they reached the memorial wall, James stopped in front of panel 33E, his eyes scanning the names until he found what he was looking for. Robert Martinez. His best friend. The kid from San Antonio who'd been killed by sniper fire 3 days before their unit was scheduled to rotate home. Found him, James whispered, reaching out to touch the carved letters with trembling fingers. Marcus stood beside him in respectful silence as James began the conversation he'd been rehearsing for 47 years. He talked about coming home, about the protests and the spitting and the way people looked at them like they were monsters. He talked about the nightmares and the guilt and the way the war had followed him home and never really ended. But mostly, he talked about remembrance. About making sure Bobby's sacrifice hadn't been forgotten. About carrying the weight of survival and the responsibility of testimony. Other visitors gave them space, understanding that something sacred was happening. The woman whose brother had died at Khe Sanh left her folded flag at the base of the wall near Robert Martinez's name. The machine gunner from 3rd Battalion stood at attention and rendered a slow, perfect salute. For 30 minutes, James spoke to his friend's name on the wall. Marcus never interrupted, never hurried him, never suggested it was time to leave. He understood that this moment had been 47 years in the making, and that some conversations can't be rushed. When James finally stepped back from the wall, his eyes were clearer than they'd been in years. The weight he'd been carrying seemed lighter somehow, as if sharing it with the memorial had made it more bearable. "Thank you, son," he said to Marcus. "I couldn't have done this without you." "No, sir. You could have done it without me. You earned the right to be here a long time ago. I just helped remove an obstacle that shouldn't have been there in the first place." As they walked back toward the memorial entrance, James realized that something fundamental had changed. Not just about his visit to the memorial, but about his understanding of what service meant. The young SEAL who'd stood up for him represented a new generation of warriors, but they carried the same values, the same commitment to brotherhood, the same understanding that some things were worth fighting for. "Can I ask you something, son?" James said as they reached the gate. "Of course, sir." "Why did you do it? Why did you get involved?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "My grandfather served in Korea. He spent the last 20 years of his life feeling forgotten by the military, disconnected from the brotherhood he'd once been part of. I made a promise at his funeral that I'd do whatever I could to make sure other veterans didn't feel that way." He paused, looking back at the memorial wall. "Besides, sir, everything I know about being a warrior, about honor and sacrifice and putting others before yourself, I learned from men like you. Marines who served at Kisan, soldiers who fought at Normandy, sailors who died at Pearl Harbor. You didn't just serve your country, you created the foundation that men like me stand on." James felt tears threatening again, but this time they weren't tears of frustration or sadness. They were tears of recognition, of being seen and understood and valued by someone who represented the future of the brotherhood he'd thought had forgotten him. "The least I could do," Marcus continued, "was make sure you could visit their memorial." They exchanged contact information before parting ways. Marcus would visit James at the assisted living facility twice over the next month, bringing other young service members with him to hear stories about Vietnam and Kisan and what it meant to serve with honor in an unpopular war. James would live for another 8 months, long enough to see his grandson graduate from Marine boot camp, long enough to attend a ceremony where Marcus was promoted to Chief Petty Officer, long enough to know that the brotherhood he'd served would continue long after he was gone. But that day at the memorial, all they knew was that something important had happened, that respect had been given and received, that dignity had been restored through one person's willingness to stand up for what was right, that sometimes the greatest act of service isn't charging a machine gun nest or defusing a bomb or completing an impossible mission. Sometimes it's simply holding a gate open for someone who earned the right to walk through it. Sometimes it's remembering that the policies we create to protect sacred places shouldn't become barriers that prevent the very people we're honoring from visiting those places. That bureaucracy should serve remembrance, not prevent it. That the greatest memorial we can offer our veterans isn't carved in granite or cast in bronze. It's ensuring they know their service mattered, their sacrifice was worthwhile, and their brotherhood endures. The young SEAL who held the gate open that day didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a guardian, protecting something sacred from the indifference of bureaucracy. The old Marine who'd been turned away didn't see himself as a victim. He saw himself as part of something larger, something that transcended time and rank and the fading of official identification cards. And the memorial itself became what it was always meant to be, not just a place to remember the dead, but a place where the living could find connection, purpose, and proof that service to something greater than yourself creates bonds that can never be broken by time, distance, or the petty enforcement of misguided policies. Some walls are built to keep people out, but the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was built to bring people home. And sometimes, when bureaucracy threatens to pervert that purpose, it takes one person with courage and clarity to remember what really matters. Not the rules, not the policies, not the procedures, the people, the service, the brotherhood that transcends everything else. This story was brought to you by Echoes of Honor. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Maybe someone who served in silence, sacrificed without complaint, or stood up for others when no one else would. Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how their example changed your understanding of what true heroism looks like. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We'll see you in the next one.